Hi everyone, this video is part of the Debaters Council's initiative to break down motions that have come up in recently concluded tournaments. I'm Daniel Victor and I'm currently part of the motions committee, and in this video I'll be breaking down the motion which came up in Octo finals of SLSDC 2024, which is that this house believes that social movements should use the courts rather than the legislature to advance social change. So in this video, I'll be briefly going through the possible arguments that you can make for both sides, proposition and opposition. And in between them, I would possibly talking about the clashes that can come about in this debate. So firstly, let's just dive into side proposition. So side proposition, before I move on into the arguments, you have to understand that the social movements that we're talking about are most probably gonna look like movements like the feminist movement, who are pushing for a right to abortion, and LGBTQ plus movements who are pushing for rights to same-sex marriages and things of that sort. And another thing that you possibly have to understand in this debate is that this debate is most likely taking place in a context where there is a certain level of opposition to this sort of social change. For example, in a country where the majority of people are conservatives, hence which is why we're discussing which sort of solution is better for you to bring about this social change, whether it's the courts or the legislature itself. So the first argument that I'd probably be that I'd like to talk about is about why using the legislature to bring about social change is ineffective. So underneath this argument, you can possibly talk about the characterization of legislatures themselves. When you look at the parliament, the people elected into these parliaments, the MPs, are probably elected by the majoritarian demographic. In certain cases, this could look like conservatives who are against things like gay rights, who are against things like abortion and things of that sort. And the second characterization that you could probably use is that politicians have their own electoral incentives. That is to say, they are often self-interested in order to get re-elected once more. And because of that, they are most likely to cater to the voter base who elected them in the first place. So the voter base that I previously talked about in these sorts of countries are, for example, have a large portion of conservatives who are in opposition to this social change. And because of that, you can say in order for these politicians to be re-elected, they are less likely to push for bills that want to bring about social change. For example, bills that want to bring about things like abortion, same-sex marriages, and things of that sort. And another sort of reason that you could use under this argument as to why using the legislature is ineffective is that you can say, even if you have people who can be sympathetic to your cause, for example, if you have Democrats who can be sympathetic towards things like LGBTQ plus rights, you can say that in most instances, when it comes to the legislature, these people are most probably not gonna vote people on single issues like these sorts of minority issues. These people are most probably gonna vote politicians who talk about policies that are sort of proximate to them. For example, this can look like things like voting them on the basis of things like economic policies rather than their policies on minorities itself. So you can say, even if you have sympathetic people out there for your cause, these people can still vote in these sorts of conservative politicians to the parliament itself. Another level of analysis that you could probably use is that you could say, even if you were able to elect left-leaning politicians in these sorts of legislatures, these politicians might not necessarily push these issues brought about by these social movements to the forefront, because they know that if they sort of take firm stances on controversial issues, this might alienate some of their voter bases. For example, people who are sort of on the fence, and therefore you can say these people are most likely to put these not bring these issues to the forefront as well. And these are some levels of reasonings that you could use as well. And so these are some of the sort of the structural reasons that even if you push for change in the legislature, why that is unlikely to bring about very swift change. So after establishing the reasons as to why it's very unlikely that you are gonna get meaningful change through the legislature for the sort of structural reasons that we talked about previously, you can also run on a few even if levels. You can say that even if social movements have the ability to bring about change through the legislature, you have to say that it's a prerequisite for them to sort of persuade these persuade the politicians in these legislatures to push for the issues. And in order for you to do that, you sort of like have to lobby to these politicians. You can say that in these sorts of societies that is particularly tough, because there are also other groups with opposing interests lobbying against your groups. For example, this could look like conservative religious groups who are in direct opposition to the social change that you're pushing for. For example, things like the right to abortion, right to same-sex marriages, and things of that sort. So irrespective of the reasons that I previously talked about, you could also say that even if you wanted to do something like put public pressure on the politicians in order to bring about social change, you still need to do things like actively sustain protests to create discourse, change mindsets of people in society, to bring about more people support your cause. But you could say certain social movements which have like a smaller amount of people, a smaller amount of supporters, are at a disadvantage in this situation, because they might not have the resources to actively sustain these sorts of protests in order to create more discourse. So now I'll be moving on into the second argument about why court systems are objectively better. So underneath this argument, you need to spend a bit of time characterizing as to why judges are objectively better than politicians themselves. So when you consider judges or Supreme Court justices, these people do not have electoral incentives. They don't need to be re-elected every 4 years. Once they're appointed into the Supreme Court bench, they're probably going to stay there until they retire on their own. So afterwards, you also need to spend a bit of time talking about the sort of nature of decisions that they take in the Supreme Court. For example, when it comes to certain issues, like for example, on sensitive issues like on the right to abortion, right to same-sex marriages, when a court issue has been brought up, these sort of judges in these court systems base their decisions solely on legal reasoning and constitutional interpretation. For example, when it comes to things like legalizing same-sex marriages, they are probably going to use the equal protection clause or equality of rights clause in the Constitution, and there's probably going to sort of like extend that in order to sort of like justify legalizing or giving certain rights. So even if side opposition argues that judges in certain instances can take bad decisions, this can lead to bad precedents, you can certainly weigh the likelihood of these bad decisions made by these judges against the likelihoods of bad decisions made by the politicians themselves. And you can also sort of like say that trying to establish social change through courts takes less resources than attempting to make social change through the legislature itself, for the reasons that we talked about in the previous argument. In order to change the attitudes of people to get to the legislature, you need to actively sustain protests and things of that sort, things like lobbying, which takes up a lot of resources. And when it comes to trying to create social change through the court system itself, in most instances all you need is basically a few good lawyers with a good legal strategy. And in most instances, for these social movements itself, you can use a few reasons as to why it's likely that you're probably going to have like even pro bono lawyers who will passionately fight for your cause. So now I'll be talking about the third argument about how you are able to change public perspectives better than inside opposition's comparative. So underneath this argument, you could possibly use a few levels of analysis. The first one is that you could possibly talk about the fact that these court rulings or these verdicts that set legal precedents often carry the weight of being objective and impartial, since they're based on the Constitution itself rather than in opposition's comparative. Even if a change was about to come, they would be based on political compromises of the parties within the legislature itself. And another level of analysis that you could possibly talk about is that when court rulings give a certain verdict on a certain issue, certain people see it as morally right, since the Constitution itself is the highest legal authority of the country, as opposed to if the change came about through the legislature, it might see as a result of like a temporary political decision which came about because of the political compromises of multiple parties there. And you could say that this in turn depoliticizes and creates creates productive discourse on certain issues, because when you're bringing about these issues in the court system itself, you're framing it in terms of legal principles like freedom and equality, as opposed to opposition's comparative. If you bring up these issues about in the legislature, people in certain instances might see it as a certain group trying to push a certain political agenda, which might not sit along well with some people, and which this makes the public less likely to be open to accept this sort of change. And underneath this argument, you could also talk about the importance of a legal precedent, which is quite debatable, because side opposition could also possibly talk about the fact that things can get even worse. You might set a bad precedent if the court gives a ruling that is not in favor of your social movement. But that is even still debatable, because you can still debate about the likelihood of of an unfavorable verdict being given to your social movement. So that is also something that could possibly be talked about within the debate. So now, moving on into the arguments of side opposition. The burden that you need to take as side opposition in this debate is to prove that even if you are able to get faster social change through the court systems, you are only able to get sustainable change through the legislature itself. So now moving on into the first argument, which is about why you create sustainable change on your side. So underneath this argument, you could say that the legislature in a certain country is a reflection of the people's will, because the people have appointed the representatives who they believe would make the laws or pass legislature that is in their best interests, and that is how the legislature gains its legitimacy. So even if courts give a certain ruling on a certain issue, even if it is like objectively right, if it overrules the legislature, you could say that people believe that these court rulings have overturned the democratic process, and they might lose trust in it, and people might oppose the sort of court ruling, because they feel like that the democratic will has been bypassed here, and you could say that this leads to backlash. So as in any debate, just saying a certain course of action would lead to backlash is not enough. You need to mechanize and talk about the impacts of this particular backlash and why this is bad. In this debate, you can say that you can impact it and show that it increases things like discrimination. So for example, if you consider the United States, there was this sort of like famous court ruling, which was Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated schools in the United States, which was through a court ruling. And you could say, in these instances, when people's attitudes haven't been changed yet, if you pass certain things like this through a court ruling, the discrimination that these people face could be worse as well. So even if these kids get to go to school, since the social attitudes of the people haven't been changed there, these people are still face things like discrimination and things of that sort. And therefore, this sort of court ruling is not enough. You need to bring about change through the legislature. So another level of analysis that you could use is that you could say that courts can only rule or give verdicts on specific cases. They cannot create legislature. So even if you pass like certain favorable verdicts for your social movements through these courts, the impact of this is that you still cannot create positive legislature to sort of like implement this sort of verdict that has been brought about by the court, implementing any sort of right that has been like legalized by the court. This is because the attitudes of people in society haven't still changed, and therefore there is no legal incentive for the representatives of people within these parliaments to create legal frameworks that address these sorts of broader issues. So you could say that it's objectively better for you to focus solely on bringing about social change through the legislature, because if you get enough critical mass to pass laws through these legislatures, that is only when you can create detailed enough legal frameworks to address these sorts of social issues, as opposed to a court where you only are able to get rulings that give you certain rights, but not the ways of like implementing them, which the legislature can do it much better. And and underneath this argument, you could also possibly talk about the idea that if you by any chance get an unfavorable verdict from the court, how it will get a negative precedent, and how it will hold back change for years, because in most cases these sorts of verdicts can only be overturned when a new sort of bench of justices is appointed to the court, which might take a really long time. Also keep in mind that even though we talked about the independent benefits of pushing for change through the legislature, it is a very important prerequisite that you prove that in order for you to actually get politicians within these legislatures to pass bills on these issues, you need a large amount of public support. Even the people who are not in your social movement, you need them to agree with the cause of your social movement. So in order for you to do that, you need to actively do things like mobilize your social movement together, to do things like protests, to do things like civil disobedience campaigns, or whatever it needs to create discourse and to change the attitudes of people within society itself. So you need to possibly spend a bit more time talking about the generic analysis about bringing about discourse in society, changing people's attitudes, because all of that is a pretty important prerequisite for you to prove that social change will happen. Not social change, actually changing people's mindsets will happen, and only if that happens you can mobilize a large amount of people's support to put pressure on the legislature itself in order for you to pass bills that are going to bring about social change, or that aligns with your social movement. So that is really important, and you need to spend a lot of time proving that as well. So with that being said, now I'd like to move on into the final argument that I had in mind for side opposition as well, about why you can change people's perspectives better if you pass things through the legislature rather than the court itself. This is in direct contrast to the third argument that we talked about for side proposition. So underneath this argument, you could talk about the fact that people are more likely to feel that whatever decision that the legislature takes reflects their democratic process. Even those who disagree will sort of accept the decision, because even though they might not agree with it, they will agree with the decision itself. They might sort of be consoled by the fact that the decision which was taken in the legislature is still an actual reflection of the will of the majority, which upholds the principles of democracy. So that is one thing that you could talk about. And you could also say that legislative processes, as opposed to the court process that we talked about in the third argument of the prop case, involves publicly debating these sorts of bills that are going to be passed about by the legislature. And people feel that this is fair because they feel that at least the people's representatives who are in the parliament has had a chance to engage with it, or at least debate about the certain merits or cons that come about with that bill, and having a chance to engage with it, as opposed to in the comparative, where you sort of push for these changes through the court system itself. In those instances, people will feel like those decisions have been taken within a vacuum within the court system by the justices who have a disconnect with the public, as opposed to the public representatives on our side who have been elected by these people themselves. So those are all the arguments that I'd possibly run for both prop and opt for this debate.